Thank you very much for inviting me this morning. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'm going to be using two computers, so bear with me if I have to keep turning my head just to make this work. As Steve said, my name is Robert Beckford. I'm an academic and broadcaster. I'm a theologian by trade. So what I want to do is bring some of the methods from my discipline to share with you this morning to engage in this important subject. What do we mean by breaking the cycle? Breaking the cycle describes transforming the structures of the educational system to change the representation of leadership, staff, and the role models in the sector. According to the government's own figures, less than 4% of all teaching staff in British schools are from non-white backgrounds. This is not an issue particular to primary or secondary school education, because racialized inequalities pervade all areas of the sector of learning, from schools to universities. Given that my experience of this predicament is in higher education, I want to make a few suggestions for your consideration based on an analysis from my discipline and experience that arise out of my context. The lens through which I want to explore the underrepresentation in school staff is the Black Lives Matter protest. There are three symbols embedded in this movement that I suggest present critical perspectives on how to break the cycle. The symbols are breath, action, and taking the knee. I want to convert these symbols into trajectories for action. And these trajectories are presented as invitations. I want to invite you to breathe, to take action, and to take a knee. These three themes, while emerging from concrete tragic circumstances of human suffering, nonetheless point towards a positive agency. Positive agency is essential because too often during these moments of national despair, we obsess with what is not rather than embrace what can be. Before addressing these themes and invitations, let's just remind ourselves how we got to this point of new awakening on anti-racism. The tragic death of George Floyd and the subsequent global protests against racism have pricked our national conscience, challenged our complacency, and led to deep soul-searching on the persistence of racialized inequalities. Our country's response so far, I believe, is unprecedented. A multitude of public and private institutions clamoring to publicize their anti-racist credentials and offer apology for racism. The insurers, Lloyd's of London and beverage company Green King, have gone one step further than in their declaration of solidarity. They have leapt in faith into the uncharted waters of slavery reparations. Educationists have also made their voices heard, not that they were ever silent on this issue. Studies of racial inequality in education are quotidien. But buoyed by the renewed interest, academics researching Black education have filled newspaper columns, online blogs, and Zoom conferences with evidence of the deficiencies in education. What educationalists have in common with business chiefs, and there aren't too many commonalities, is an acknowledgement that this is a kairos moment, a creative, liminal space fecund with transformative potential. Central to this kairos moment, however, is an opportunity to dismantle white supremacy. White supremacy is a complex and historically contingent concept and practice, yet dismantling it is essentially concerned with taking apart the theories and practices that maintain the superiority and domination of people racialized as white. It is intimately related to whiteness, the structures that maintain white privilege in culture, education, and politics. And dismantling it requires more than intellectual assent. It also necessitates a re-engineering of education and polity to normalize anti-racism and inclusivity. While this renewed interest in education and anti-racism is a welcome first step on the road to ending enduring inequalities, a question that we cannot avoid is how we can ensure that this time we take full advantage of the window of opportunity. How can we break the cycle? After all, we've been here before. We should be cautious because previous public awareness of racialized oppression has not resulted in substantive or long-term change. The Scarman Report after the Briskin uprisings of 1981, the Macpherson Report after the tragic death of Stephen Lawrence in 1991, the Lammy Report of 2017, the McGregor-Smith Report on Racism in the Workplace 2017, the Timpson Report in Schools Exclusion 2019, all make compelling recommendations. There are currently 200 recommendations for anti-racism that the government is yet to act upon. The fact that we have failed to make the necessary progress on institutionalized racism suggests at best a lack of commitment and at worst, good old-fashioned British hubris. So how do we make sure that this time we take full advantage of the present social climate? How do we drive home the necessary changes to break the cycle? Now, I don't have all the answers. Theologians like to think that they do, but we really do not. But I do think we can gain new impetus and insight from the renewed interest in anti-racism as a result of the gains made by the Black Lives Matter movement. So let me invite you, first of all, to take a breath. The first invitation is an invitation to breathe. Breathing is a metaphor for creating an atmosphere where Black leaders can flourish. The words "I can't breathe" are a grim and visceral, heart-rending expression of pain and suffering, and these words have a literal and symbolic meaning. It denotes literally the vulnerability to premature death faced by Black people due to a host of social inequalities. The racial disparities surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, underline the fact that under the current political economy, Black people's breath is more likely to be cut short. The words also have a symbolic register, and this is the meaning that I want to underline here. The words "I can't breathe" gesture towards the suffocating atmosphere of racism. It concerns the availability of the oxygen of inclusivity. But what is important here is that these words are a call for help. It demands a response to the chokehold of racism, to develop something different. We've seen recently on our television screens how this agency side approach can be played out within the context of a television documentary to provide an atmosphere where people, where Black students in particular and Black staff can breathe. So in regards to breaking the cycle, breathing as a metaphor for action must address the question, how do we enable Black staff to have the necessary oxygen of inclusivity to breathe within our schools? I don't think this kind of change can be achieved without serious anti-racism training and awareness, valuing and celebrating the diversity of staff and students, and filtering out the contagions that make the recruitment and retention of Black staff problematic. In short, breathing demands an anti-racist atmosphere in schools. Anti-racism is fundamentally different to non-racism. Marlon James, famous Jamaican writer, author, and activist, gets to grips with this in his, you have to bear with me, sorry, my slide has not come up there. Marlon James, the Jamaican activist and commentator, gets to grips with this when he talks about the importance, the difference between being non-racist, which means you do not subscribe to racist beliefs, and the difference between that and being anti-racist, which means you are deeply committed and actively involved in changing the way things are. I know from my experience at universities have attempted to change the racist atmosphere and practices, but these have been fundamentally flawed. This is because they emphasize a range of behavioral strategies than structural ones. Mentoring events, empowerment events, awareness days, and Black staff networks are useful, but they do not always result in a change in the structures that maintain the stifling environment. Changing the atmosphere is a structural issue. It demands a multi-leveled approach, an attack on the structures of white supremacy, and I'll touch on this a little bit later on. The second invitation is for collective direct action. This category refers to the unprecedented protests against racism and also, in relation to breaking the cycle, the necessity of direct action. The protests are unprecedented because of their global reach, with demonstrations taking place as far afield as India, Nigeria, New Zealand, for example. And explanations for this planetary interest, or the why it happened, range from the 8 minutes 45 seconds of horror that we witnessed on our screens, the COVID-19 knockdown, and the power of social media. Whatever the reasons may be, the real issue here is the strategy deployed and what it connotes. Two related things strike me as being important in terms of strategy. These are multicultural and direct action. It's clear from the protest that a sizable portion of Generation M and Z, who are racialized as white, have come to understand that racism is not a black problem. It's rooted in the history and politics of white supremacy. Therefore, people racialized as white must do the work of anti-racism. White allies in the struggle against racial injustice have been there within British history and the politics of education. The problem, however, is that there have been too few of them. And sometimes when they are needed, really, really needed, they're not ready or prepared. Consequently, the leadership necessary to make difficult changes has been lacking. Second, the protests signify that direct action is not an option, but the option for change. According to the political philosophy of philosopher Saul Alinsky, direct action is not an appeal to others to make the necessary changes, but instead that people of good faith and good conscience use their power to take control. Taking control in regards to breaking the cycle is not an act of blind faith. It's informed by decades of research. The evidence and resources are out there. David Lammy makes this point in his criticism of Boris Johnson and the way in which Boris Johnson has failed to take on board the fact that action can take place because the recommendations already exist.
I don't know why he's announced a commission behind a paywall in the Telegraph, buried in the middle of yet another article about Churchill. If he was serious, why are there no details about how it will be staffed? Its remit, its terms of reference, its timetable. That's the question. It's because this was written on the back of a fag packet yesterday to assuage the Black Lives Matter protest. Get on with the action, legislate, move, you're in government, do something. I made 35 specific recommendations in the Lammy Review, implement them. There are 110 recommendations in the Angelini Review into deaths in police custody, implement them. There are 30 recommendations in the Home Office review into the Windrush scandal, implement them. 26 into Baroness McGregor's review into workplace discrimination, implement them. That's what Boris has to do. And the Black Lives protest can stop and we can get on with dealing with the coronavirus.
What if the Commission decides that what you have just said is right and advises the government to do those things?
Well, I guess we've got a 6-month delay, public taxpayers' money paid out for yet another review commission, and we are no further forward than we are today.
Direct action can be taken in schools today. For instance, journalist Lola Olorisi's recent interview with head teachers identified 3 things schools can do immediately to break the cycle. These are treating racism as a safeguarding or health and safety issue, blind recruitment practices to address unconscious bias in hiring, establishing mentorship and coaching necessary for Black teachers' progression, and finally, diversifying the curriculum within the frameworks available to teachers. Taking a knee is the third invitation. Now, let me be clear about what this means. Regarding breaking the cycle, taking the knee signifies dismantling oppressive structures. It is the diametric opposite to having the knee of white supremacy on your neck. The video footage of the police officer's knee used as a lethal weapon is not just live footage of a murderous act, it also signifies a protracted history of state violence against Black people in the Black Atlantic. The act of violence underlines the problem of Black pain in the Western imagination. Black pain is either oblivious to whiteness or legitimate, relevant for the disciplining or disposing of unwanted Black flesh. It is an application of the contemporary, it's an application of the contemporary ritual of resistance. Taking a knee, and what I want to do with this is take the resistance symbol that we see demonstrated by the American quarterback, Colin Kaepernick, and his protest, the protest which cost him his livelihood 4 years ago, which doesn't seem so out of place today. I want to use this as a way of thinking about what it means to dismantle the structures. For Colin Kaepernick, he thought about it this way. He said, I performed this gesture because, quote, I was not going to stand up and show pride in a flag for a country that was opposed to Black people and people of color. To me, this is bigger than football, and it would be selfish on my part to look the other way. There are bodies in the streets and people getting paid leave and getting away with murder, unquote. The gesture has morphed now into a pre-match sporting ritual to end racism. And while the mainstream appropriation is essential for awareness raising, like all commodification or resistance motifs, there's the danger that the original intention will be lost or sanitized. A bit like the way the cross of Jesus, the symbol of terror, has been turned into a contemporary object of beauty. No, what matters here is that we work with the idea that protesting state violence is the original intention of taking the knee. And taking the knee is shorthand for dismantling white supremacy. White supremacy is the structure, the systems and processes, discourses, which deliberately or unwittingly maintain white skin color privilege. White supremacy is not just a behavior to be fixed, but a set of practices and methods to dismantle. It's not a fringe problem, but ingrained within Western history and in culture and intellectualism. Dismantling white supremacy is a threefold process: identifying the way whiteness as a structure works, establishing new anti-racist practices, and evaluating their effectiveness as part of an ongoing maintenance of equality and equity. In relation to the specificity of the question of breaking the cycle, that is addressing leadership and representation, dismantling white supremacy poses several challenges. We have to rethink the white male leader template. This is a structural issue which I think can be confronted in job descriptions and interview processes. Dismantling structures also requires a reevaluation of good leadership. What would retention and leadership look like if we placed a premium on diversity valuing practices and behavior, so that teachers with this set of skills and this set of abilities were rewarded for work in this field? In addition to these challenges, we need to also acknowledge that it's going to be necessary for some people racialized as white to have to just give up power as an act of restorative justice. In conclusion, arguably there's never been a more conducive time for change within school recruitment and retention. The cultural and social environment, with few exceptions, is arced towards racial justice. There are more Black graduates in education now than ever before. 1 in 4 undergraduates are Black, Asian, or mixed heritage. A higher proportion are engaged in postgraduate research. And in terms of career options, teaching is still a vibrant and attractive option even more so in the current graduate employment environment. As with the case, with every invitation, you have a choice. You can ignore it, put it off, or take up the offer. So, in closing, again, to ensure that diverse staff are recruited, retained, and promoted, I invite you to breathe, create the right kind of anti-racist environment, to act on the existing recommendations, and to take a knee to dismantle the structures of white supremacy. Thank you.